Hey there, listeners. Well, today's episode is known as Build the Bridge of Trust. And I have a wonderful guest. His name is Matt Bodnar, and he is the founding partner of an organization called Eidolon Capital. He's a Forbes 30 under 30. And he's also the creator and host of a podcast called Science of Success. Now, what we did talk about was that rapport building is the most foundational aspect that a leader can do. Also, build the bridge of trust to navigate choppy times. And we also talked about the importance of collaborative leadership. Hey, it's a fantastic episode and Matt shared a lot. So sit back and enjoy the episode.
Welcome to Leadership is Changing. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change. This is taking your leadership to another level by finding the balance between executive excellence and personal well-being through stories that inspire real change. It's time to adapt in our fast-moving world when leadership is changing with your host, Denis Giannoutsas.
Hey there, listeners. Welcome to another wonderful episode of the Leadership is Changing podcast. Great to have you here with us. I've got a great guest with me today. His name is Matt Bodnar. Matt, a massive welcome to you.
Dennis, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be here and I can't wait to dig in.
Excellent. Now, whereabouts in the world are you today?
I am in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm living in the past and you're living in the future.
Yeah, true. Very much so on different sides of the world. And being in Nashville, can you sing or can you play a guitar?
I have absolutely zero musical talent. So no athletic abilities, no musical talents. I was a debater in high school. That's about the only capability I really had, but fortunately it served me reasonably well.
Well, that's good, though. You can sit in that city or in that place where you are because everyone else can do it while you can sit back and enjoy it.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I understand that you are the founding partner at Eidolon Capital and a Forbes 30 under 30 alumni and partner in multiple Inc. fastest growing companies. So that's a little bit about you, but tell us more about your background.
Yeah, that's so short bio on me. I'm from Nashville, actually grew up here, and I worked at Goldman Sachs up in New York for a number of years out of school. Came back to Nashville in 2011 and stumbled into I did a couple different things when I came back, but one of the things I did was stumbled into buying a small technology company. It was at the time actually a reseller of point of sale terminals. Super boring, super random, but bought that business. Not really. It was basically could barely make payroll, a little defunct company. Ran it for a number of years, grew it, did a few other acquisitions, and eventually fired myself out of running that business and started really investing basically full time, built a platform called Eidolon Capital where we look at, invest in, buy, acquire businesses. And I'm happy to tell you more about our thesis and sort of stuff we have in the portfolio and what we look at or any and all of those things.
Yeah. What made you buy that original business, the point of sale business?
Honestly, I was relatively young. It was opportunistic. I didn't necessarily set out to do that. I just knew the founder. It's basically a family friend. And he was really struggling. It's classic entrepreneur stuff, right? So they used to sell these, they would sell about an average sale for them, about a $50,000 installation of all this hardware. And they would have probably $30,000 of hard costs and expenses in that installation and $20,000 of margin. But they would sell these things and they sold them mostly into the restaurant space, right? Because they're selling sort of point of sale, like what they used to key the orders into before everything was an iPad. And they would sell them. They'd go spend 30K on their hardware, and then they would really do a very poor job of collecting their bills. And so they had hundreds of thousands of dollars of uncollected receivables and didn't have enough cash to be able to make payroll. And so I spent the first probably 6 months of my relationship with them just pounding on doors, getting thrown out of places, people throwing stuff at me, threatening to shut their systems down, all that sort of stuff. But I learned one of the most fundamental lessons in business, which is that profits don't necessarily equal cash. And it's a cliche, but cash is king. And so I really got a great sense of the cash cycles of a business and how they work. And that helped me form my foundation of how I thought about that company and then ultimately future investments as well.
Yeah, probably a really good grounding for you, a foundation of learning about all of that you just shared, which is really good. So, yeah, tell us more about your organization, what you do, how you do it, that type of thing. And because I know we're going to be talking about leadership is changing, but I think it's an organization that you've got as well, is that you're buying businesses. And if a lot of that is about leadership, but a lot of that is about change as well for the employees, for the business
Definitely.
and the customers and so forth. So, tell us more about that.
Yeah. So what we do at the end of the day is you put it very succinctly, we buy businesses and we invest in and acquire companies. The industry term for it, I guess, would be private equity, but that kind of conjures up images of Darth Vader, evil masterminds tearing companies apart and stuff. And we try not to do that. Our thesis is really, to some extent, informed by books like Conscious Capitalism by John Mackey and others, where we're looking for companies that we can buy. We have a very long term investment horizon typically. And so we want to invest in the business. We want to help it really get to the next level. A lot of companies, especially ones that we like to look at, are really old, unprofessionalized. And I'm happy to tell you some crazy war stories about companies that don't have websites and the whole business operates with pen and paper and all kinds of stuff like that, which still happens to this day. And you'd be surprised companies making millions of dollars operate as if it was 1974. But we try to take those businesses and modernize them. And especially for sellers who are thinking about legacy and the home for ultimately what they're going to do, we provide them with a path that's an alternative to either shutting it down or selling to a competitor or something to that effect. And so, as you hit on, there's a ton of leadership and variety of things that goes into that. One is not just leadership of the portfolio businesses that we invest in, which is a critical piece of what we do on a day-to-day basis, but I think there's also a lot of leadership dynamics that go into the transition, even the relationship with the seller of the business, how we think about connecting with them, understanding them, and ultimately forming deals that work for them and work for us and hopefully are win-win deals.
Yeah. Okay, good. The other question I got with you as you were talking about it is a couple things here. The modernizing, we'll talk about that in a minute, but the legacy. I'm finding that with the way things are in the world, you're getting a lot of people who have got successful businesses. Scale's different, right? There might be 500K, 1 mil, 50 mil, 100 mil, whatever it is. But they're at an age whereby they're 60, 65, things like that. And there's nobody else in the family to take over the business. They
Yep.
don't know what to do. So what are people doing nowadays with those kind of businesses?
Well, I don't know the stats in New Zealand in particular, but I do know the stats for the US. And there's something that a lot of folks talk about called the silver tsunami, which
Mm,
is basically the demographic trend as baby boomers mature and get older, that there's a need for a lot of businesses to potentially change hands. So there's estimates about this and they vary a little bit. I've done a bunch of research on it. And roughly speaking, at least in the US, there's around 33 to 34 million privately held businesses in total. And the estimate is that about half of those businesses, the low end is in the high 30s, 40% range. The high is up to 60%, are owned just by baby boomers. And so if you think about that, now the vast majority of those businesses, just to be clear, I think 27 million out of the 30, 33, 35 million are all sole proprietorships. So the vast majority, there's not a huge employee base and stuff, but that's still millions and millions of businesses that need to transact over the next 10, 20 years. And as you perfectly hit on, most of their kids don't really want to take over their parents' plumbing business. They'd rather be TikTok influencers, right?
yeah.
And or do something in crypto or AI or whatever. And so there's tons of these businesses that not only already don't really have a great home, but ultimately won't have a home. And even if you take an assumption that the vast majority of those will close or not be marketable or saleable or whatever, if you have rough math, 15 million businesses that need to transact over a 20-year period, that's still a massive number of companies. Even if 80% or 90% of those businesses are not marketable, that would still be, over a million or 2 or 3 million businesses that wouldn't normally be in the annual flow of businesses that are bought and sold that are going to hit the market. And most of those businesses don't have a home. There's nobody to take over or shepherd the legacy. A lot of them will shut down. Some of them will find buyers. But our strategy, candidly, is just to position ourselves as best we can in the flow of that and try to find a few opportunities that make sense and that we think we can grow and that fit our thesis about what we want to do and where we see the world going.
That's huge numbers that you're just sharing now. It's amazing where it's going. What makes them not marketable?
Tons of things. For starters, sole proprietorships are generally challenging to sell, right? So a business that's just the business owner effectively has a job that is technically a business, right? Those are another term that we use sometimes in the industry is we call them dancing bears, right? So it's the bear stops dancing and the money stops coming in. And those businesses oftentimes are just really difficult to transact for several reasons, one of which being if the seller stops doing their thing, does revenue completely stop? Now, maybe not. Maybe if they're an account maybe they do fulfill all the revenue, but they could sell their book of business to another accountant or something like that that could fulfill it. But in that case, how many of those are really tethered to the relationship to the seller, right?
Mm.
Even if it's not about the fulfillment of the work, the seller's 20-year friend, if the seller's like, hey, you should totally go use Dennis instead of me, some percentage of people might do that, but a bunch of them might be like, well, if you're retiring, I'm going to shop around and see if I can find somebody else that I really like, right? And so a lot of those will be really really difficult to transact and will probably just close. Now savvy business owners can still find ways to monetize that, and one of the best deal structures that really works for both parties on sole proprietorships that are closing down is for the sole proprietor to transition their book of business over to a competitor or somebody in the space for an earnout or a rev share or something to that effect, to basically say, hey, I'll give you all my customers and you pay me 5 or 10% of the revenue they generate over the next few years. It's a much softer landing than just closing your doors one day and all your customers have to figure out what they do with their lives from there.
Yeah. Well, I've just experienced a little bit of this in the sense that my insurance agent, who's got my life insurance and things like that, he's passed away. He had terminal cancer and he's died, and it's really, really quite sad.
Oh
But now
gosh.
the family have sold his book, his insurance customers and all that to another organization. The first phone call that I get from the new people is, hi, this is me. We've taken over. I got an email and then we've taken over. Well, how can we
Yep.
help you with your insurance needs? And I'm like, dumb. Just like build a relationship with me first, and then
Yep.
let's start talking about the insurance needs, right? But you haven't even asked me who I am and all that sort of stuff. And I'm like, come on, man, wake up. And I
Yep.
think even from leaders as well, they need to start to think about people and start growing those relationships. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's absolutely true. And I think that applies in a sales context, it applies in a customer retention context, but it even applies in the context of buying businesses, which is where we obviously spend the bulk of our time. I would say rapport building is one of the most foundational elements of how we do business and how we transact, how we buy companies. We really substantially invest in the relationship with the business owner and the seller. And to a very, very large degree, it's a absolutely fundamental element of how we do deals. And I'm happy to tell you some stories about that. But for us, that relationship, that connection, and establishing that well before getting into deal economics and terms and price and all of that is really critical, because at the end of the day, if you have a strong relationship, and another piece of this too that is really fundamental to how we think about doing deals is having a deep understanding of what the seller wants to accomplish. What
Right.
are their goals? What are their needs? What are their desires? Because if you understand their wants, needs, goals, desires, where they're going, and you have a really good relationship with them and you've built the bridges of trust and common ground, it's so much easier to build a deal that both people feel really good about. And it's also in any deal, any business acquisition, it's very common that you're going to hit some landmines, roadblocks, documents, something changes. The vast majority of deals have some sort of 11th hour crisis, whatever it might be, whether it's in due diligence or legal, et cetera. And if you have that bridge that's been built, it's much easier to navigate than it is if it's an adversarial, hostile parties on either side feeling each other out and positioning. That's where oftentimes deals can blow up because there's not enough mutual trust. So I'm a huge believer in building rapport, understanding the other person's needs, wants, goals, and desires, et cetera. And I think that's an absolutely fundamental piece of certainly buying businesses, doing deals, but I think it's really a fundamental piece of any business activity that involves leadership, human interaction, sales, all the above.
Excellent. I really like what you're saying here. The rapport building is really a foundational side of things. That's one. But the other one is about building that bridge of trust. And I've written down these notes of enabling you to navigate the choppy times, but I'm not sure how else to say that. But it's about navigating those headwinds, if I can put it that way, that
Yeah,
may come up in the
absolutely.
11th hour. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, you talked about, I've got a whole of other questions for you too, Matt, but before we go there, you said about modernize the business.
Yep.
How do you modernize it? Because I think nowadays, what I look at businesses and leaders and so forth, I keep saying to them, processes, systems, automation, a lot of that kind of stuff is very, very important. Now, if you're going to go and sell a business and you have those things in place, I think the business is going to be of more value for the
No
buyer.
question.
Yeah, yeah. Yep. Is that how you modernize it, or is there other things as well?
Those are big pieces of it. So I'll give you a couple examples or case studies of just businesses that we've been a part of. So we bought a business a few years ago, and the business was a 51-year-old company at the time that we bought it. And I'll give you two case studies from their company, one on the operations side, one on the marketing side. So operationally, the entire company operated with pen and paper, carbon copy order forms. And they had actual the term inbox, right? Most folks don't even know what an inbox was originally. I mean, they had the paper inboxes where and this business was selling, I mean, they were doing 20, 30, 50 of these a day where they're filling them out by hand, putting them in an inbox, carrying them back to the billing department. The billing department's taking them, hand keying them in, doing it was incredibly inefficient, right? So one of the first things we did is we said, hey, we looked at a couple, but there was a pretty best in class software for that particular industry that would digitize that entire workflow and save everybody huge amounts of time and energy and headache. So that was a very easy operational modernization, right? So that's on the operating side. And it's surprisingly common where you uncover this stuff. Like you think, oh, of course, nobody's actually doing that anymore. There's tons of companies that are still doing this kind of stuff. So that's one. On the marketing side, same business. Their entire marketing spend was a TV commercial that was filmed in the early 90s that didn't feature any products that they still had in stock. And they were airing it every single week. And that's all they spent on marketing. So we said, hey, instead of doing that, let's take the same marketing dollars. We don't even have to change our budget. And we're just going to allocate them to digital marketing strategies where we can measure some return on our activities, right? So things like local search, SEO, digital media, those sorts of things. And I think we grew revenue by 30% in the first 12 months just by reallocating that ad spend. And then the spend was $5,000 a month or something. It wasn't like they weren't spending some astronomical sum, but the idea is we just more efficiently allocated the same dollars and as a result saw a much more positive impact. So I think both of those are good examples of just the kinds of stuff that you'll see in a lot of businesses that, and it makes total sense. So if you think about it from the other side, if you owned a business for 25, 30 plus years and it's making good money and you don't feel like figuring out this whole new digital marketing thing, right? In the States, we have a phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it,
Mm.
right? You're making $500,000 a year. What are you, I'm going to go fool with that. I don't want to deal with any of that stuff. Yeah, sure. I could go overhaul our billing system, but whatever. I'm making $500,000 and I don't really have to think about it. And it's worked for the last 25 years. So you see that all the time where processes and systems that have been in place for a long time just stay in place because the seller has no real incentive or desire to do all the heavy lifting to professionalize that stuff. But the last thing I'll say about it is I think you hit the nail on the head, Dennis, that the businesses that have those processes already in place are much more valuable.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a big key there is the fact that they do put things in and probably going from 50 million or $500,000, whatever they are, that they're going to increase income because it's going to be a lot easier and so forth for it to be done, which is very good. We've talked about quite a bit about things about leadership. So how did you actually get into leadership yourself?
So, in a weird way, one of the reasons I like being an investor is that I don't really consider myself a great manager. Or I think, and honestly, I don't even really know if I consider myself a particularly talented leader. I think we have a reasonable leadership style, but I don't like to lead. I really like to, we have a couple frameworks around this and how we think about interacting with the companies we invest in. And the vast majority of our investments, just to be clear, are majority acquisitions, right? So we, in theory, have quote unquote control over the company, right? But just because we have control, we have a very collaborative approach to management. And we have a very collaborative approach to dealing with the management teams that run the businesses that we invest in and acquire. We're not command and control oriented. So we don't come in and say, hey, you have to do these 5 things. And if you don't, you're fired, right? We're doing X and Y, and that's how it's going to be. It's very much looking at what's going on in the business, trying to provide insights and resources and say, hey, we had another company that was facing this challenge. Here's how they solved it. Or here's a resource that we brought in, whether it's a person, a consultancy, a strategy. This is something we use to fix this particular challenge in another business. And we think it might be really useful here. And we try to keep basically a playbook of resources that we can deploy in to a given opportunity to say, hey, here's a few things that can be really helpful. And we try to be very thoughtful about our interactions with the business. We want to support them. We want to provide them with the tools, the resources to be successful, but we also don't want to be in the way. And that works when you have good people. And if a business is really struggling, if we feel like maybe the management's not the right management, then maybe we'll get more hands on. Our intent and our desire is certainly not to be command and control oriented. It's really, we want to be collaborative. We want to focus on supporting and empowering the management team, giving them the resources to be successful.
Mm. Okay, so if I could summarize that, probably the words would be collaborative leadership is the way that you probably look
Yep.
at things and you do things there. Yeah. Now, talk about leadership. Do you have a favorite leader? In other words, who's your favorite leader and why?
So if you look at our strategy, it's probably been most informed. And I don't know if you would consider him or folks would generally consider him a leader, but it's probably been most informed by Warren Buffett,
Mm.
right? In some sense, he's the CEO of a vast array of, I don't know how many tens of thousands of employees across all of his different businesses. But the reality is he hangs out in an office with like 15 people and is not leading huge management meetings and doing all this other stuff. And certainly, we're not as successful as Warren or Berkshire Hathaway by an order of several orders of magnitude. But I think that his approach and style has really informed how we look at the world. And so, similarly, we try to find good companies with good management and let them do their thing. And I think that's really his approach very, very definitively. And so, that's the leadership style that we've emulated in a lot of ways. But I don't know if you would look at Warren Buffett and say, hey, he's a great quote unquote leader, right? He's not writing leadership books and keynoting the latest conferences about leadership and so forth. Obviously, he hosts the Berkshire annual meeting, but
Mm.
he may not fit the traditional definition of a leader by a lot of folks' perspective.
Well, I think he does in the sense that he's very influential in what he
Yeah.
does. And so that's what leadership's all about. If you and Warren Buffett were sitting on a park bench somewhere having a cup of coffee, would there be one question Matt would love to ask him?
Sure, maybe it's a cheating question, but I like to ask anybody who I think is really successful and or I respect their decision making abilities meaningfully this question, which is I would try to convey as much context as possible about what I'm doing, how I'm living my life, what I'm spending my time on, and then I would ask them the question: if you and I body swapped and you woke up in my body tomorrow, what would you change? What would you do more of? What would you stop doing? What would you quit doing? What would you close, fire, shut down, cancel? What would you double down on? And see what they say. So I like that question a lot, but you have to give a lot of context for that question to really be helpful in many cases.
Oh, I think that's a fantastic question. If I did it with him, he'd probably say to me, "Oh, you might need to lose some weight, buddy."
Don't
Yeah,
look really heavy.
yeah, I know, I'm fine. I'm fine. Thanks for that. But yeah, it's yeah. But I think that question would be brilliant. I would love to know the answer to what he would say, and very, very
Well,
good.
the cool thing is, it's certainly not perfect, but anybody that you've read a fair amount of their writing, reading, seen a lot of their talks or videos or whatever, and you have a decent understanding of how they think about the world, it's a pretty fun journaling exercise to propose that as a journal question. Is like, obviously, it wouldn't be as good as them giving you the answer, but you can say, hey, if Warren Buffett woke up in my body tomorrow, what do I think he would do? Right? What would he do differently? And going through that exercise is maybe not a perfect proxy for that, but it would be a reasonable, you'd probably get 80% of the way there, like 80-20 principle. You probably get some insights from doing that. And every now and then I'll think about somebody whose opinion I really respect or is very successful. And I'll basically pose that question to myself: hey, if they woke up in my body or my life tomorrow, what would they do differently?
Yep. And I think even listeners listen to this conversation with Matt. I think that even if you go ahead and do that kind of action item and actually ask that question, and I actually say to leaders, Matt, for them to actually observe other leaders that they admire and ones that probably don't, what do they do that you don't want to do? And then the ones you do admire, what are the things they are doing to learn so then we can grow, because you are where you are, but others have succeeded. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Just go and understand where they're at and then learn from that.
You're totally right. It's funny. That is to borrow from Buffett's business partner, Charlie Munger, who uses the term mental models all the time. What you just said is a really useful mental model that is easy to forget, which is understanding a problem that's already been solved all the time. And I do this myself because it's easy to get blinders on when you're looking at something. But all the time, people ask me about challenges as if it was there's some special snowflake that they're the only person that's ever wrestled with this particular challenge. And the vast majority of the time, 98, 99% of the time, it's like, this is a solved problem.
Yep.
Like, not only one or two, like millions of people have solved this problem in some form or fashion previously. Can we figure out how they generally solved it and apply some of those lessons to you solving it? Right. And again, I fall prey to that like all the time. I think it's just natural human nature to get so stuck in your own pain and suffering and challenges and say, I'm a special snowflake and this is my suffering and there's no solution that's ever going to work until woe is me. And it's like, okay, well, has anybody ever experienced what you're experiencing before? There's billions of people. Yes, right? What did they do? Or can we find some case studies, examples, et cetera, of how they solved it?
Yep.
And it doesn't just have to apply to pain points, it can apply to anything. But you hit on a really important mental model in my mind that is this concept of most problems are solved problems. It's really a question of finding either the solution or the person who can help you solve it instead of figuring out how do I do it? In most cases, the how's already known.
Yep.
Right. It's just a question of doing it or finding the person who can help you do it.
Well, I think even those case study examples you gave before that you talked about, oh, we've seen it done here and this is what they did and this is what they. So it's actually a better, easier way to sell it. But even if you think about lawyers, right, and they go into a court case, they will look at whatever has happened in other court cases in the past to use that as an
Yep.
example or as a reason why we should do this certain thing. Yeah, very, very important. Now, we are living in a world that's very fast paced, ever changing. The title of this show is called Leadership is Changing. So when I say that title, that statement, what does it mean for you?
It's a good question. There's a lot of different implications around leadership changing. And I completely agree with you that the world is incredibly fast paced and arguably accelerating in its pace of change, which as an investor, business owner is scary, right? It's hard to think about change. Sometimes I look back or think about the whatever it is, the 1800s or the 1950s. Obviously, there were other challenges there, and many of them, but the pace of life was a little slower, more methodical. And to some extent, that seems idyllic, right? Again, tons of other challenges and barriers and issues socially and whatever else, but interesting food for thought. And so when I come back to this rapid pace of change rapid and arguably accelerating pace of change, what does that mean? To me, it means a couple things. One, which we've actually talked a decent amount about, is I think it starts with self reflection and an acknowledgement and understanding of where am I and where do I need to change, right? There's what Gandhi or whatever, right? It's like if you want to change the world, start with changing yourself. And so to me, it really starts with a self assessment of my own capabilities, resources, skill sets, et cetera. As I think about the world changing, it's like, okay, well, am I keeping pace? Am I falling behind? What do I need to do first? And then beyond that, I think the next element really comes back to another theme that we hit on a little bit, which is this idea of understanding and keeping a focus or keeping a presence or an awareness of that sort of human thread of all of this, right? So it's AI and all these crazy things reshaping the world. At the end of the day, there's a human element, and that is arguably not going to change, right?
Mm.
There's a series of books, and I forget the title of it, but it's Will and Ariel Durant wrote this, like the history of the modern world or something in like the 80s, very old book. And they did this like multi-volume thing of like all of modern history. And then they wrote this like 80-page book called Lessons of History. And it was basically like, hey, here's like the 10 biggest things we took away from studying all of human history for the last 40 years or whatever. And one of them was basically humans don't really change that much, but the means that they use to accomplish the things that they want to accomplish change dramatically. Right. And so that lesson for me, psychology, understanding human behavior, understanding why people do things, understanding how to influence people, right? Which we talked a little bit about. Those are all really, really fundamental building blocks in my mind of navigating any kind of changing environment, right? And so I don't know if that answers the question or not, but that's my perspective of how I think about leadership changing, how it interacts with me personally, how I interact with other people. And at the end of the day, understanding one of the things coming back to Charlie Munger, one of the things Munger talks about, which is Warren Buffett's business partner for decades and decades, this concept of mental models or frameworks for understanding reality. He really harps on this idea of you want to ideally study frameworks that explain reality that don't change as much or that change very slowly. And so the more you can understand frameworks that don't change, the more prepared you're going to be to navigate a world that is constantly changing.
So there's one thing that you have mentioned a few times in this episode already, and that is books. Do you read a lot?
What gave it away?
Yeah, it's the examples you're using from the books, but also you're talking about books all the time.
Yeah, no, I definitely read quite a bit. And it's funny. I think about, I've read, I mean, I don't, there's people who read a lot more than me. It's clear. I have a friend who is like borderline insane, but he reads a book. I think it's like a book a day.
Oh,
He does like 3x speed and he gets up at like 4 in the morning. But again, he's living life on a very different frontier than I am. But I read probably like 30 books a year or something, and
nice.
mostly nonfiction, though I have gone deep in a few fictional universes and stuff. And I love reading fiction. But yeah, I read a lot. And to me, it really stems back from studying Warren Buffett, right? So when I started out as an investor, one of the questions I asked myself was like, hey, there's this guy who's arguably the greatest investor of all time. Should I figure out what he's doing and what he says about investing? Right. And so the next step there is let's read all of his shareholder letters and books and biographies about him. And if you read enough Buffett, you come across Charlie Munger, right? And Charlie Munger is the one who really cracked the door on a lot of that stuff for me, because he uses the term worldly wisdom to describe this concept. But his whole premise is to really understand investing, you need to understand how the world works, right? So why companies grow and scale and die, why products sell, why people do certain things, how to influence them. It's like it gets all the way back really to like physics at the end of the day. It's like if there's I think it's Richard Feynman said something to the effect of like if you pull on any piece of reality, what you discover is it's connected to all other pieces of reality, right?
Mm.
And we could get metaphysical about that if we wanted to, but to bring it back to the business context, Munger talks about this idea of understanding the world as a whole. And the natural outcropping of that is you got to read a lot to build a framework of tools to better understand the world. And so that I think in many ways for me was the impetus for me to read a lot of books and try to better understand the world. I will say though, one book applied is better than 50 read, right?
Yeah.
And that's a lesson that I try to keep at the forefront is it's great to read a bunch of stuff and feel like you're being quote unquote productive by reading. But at the end of the day, if you just have one book that you actually really put meaningfully into practice, it's going to have a much bigger impact than doing tons and tons and tons of reading. And I think I was probably too far on the index for many years of my career on the I'm just going to sit back and feel like I'm accomplishing things by reading a bunch. And now I'm more in the mode of it's great to read and I do read, but I think it's really important to apply what I read and make it actually useful. Because if you don't apply it, it's as if you never read it to begin with.
Absolutely. Spot on. I think that there is a lot of people aren't reading enough. And when I'm saying reading, you can listen to an audio book or you can even a podcast, that's really important. But I think the thing here is that last piece you said, which is about applying it, right? And that's really good.
100%.
Because, Matt, what I say about in this podcast here is that people are overwhelmed leaders. They go from email to email, meeting to meeting. In fact, they're not changing quick enough. And then they run the risk of becoming irrelevant and being left behind. Now, the thing here is that if you are reading all the time, it's like they arrive in a leadership role and it's like, ta-da, I've arrived and that's it. Nah, you've got to keep working at it and keep developing yourself, just like you're just saying about with Warren Buffett and so forth. It's so important, but I'm not sure that leaders are doing that enough.
I think you're totally right. I don't know what the exact, it's been a minute since I looked at the stats, but something to the effect of like the average person, and I think maybe the average American reads less than one book a year. And the vast majority of those are fiction, right? And not to disparage fiction. I love fiction too. But if you're reading even a book or two, you're already ahead of the game, right? And if you're reading 5 or 10 and applying them, then you're really starting to accelerate your advantage as a leader or as anybody in doing really accomplishing anything. There's to further underscore this point, there's a really good book called The Slight Edge. It's probably a 20-year-old book at this point. That the book talks about this idea of like the whole premise of the book, which I really like, is this idea that there's no magical inflection point in the vast majority of success as a whole in any endeavor. It's really a compounding of a bunch of really small things over a long time horizon. And the phrasing that really stuck with me from that book is this idea that most successful actions are really easy to do, but they're also really easy not to do.
Yeah.
And you can just say, hey, you know what? I don't feel like reading 5 or 10 pages today. I'll do it tomorrow. And I'll do it tomorrow. And then a week goes by, and then a month goes by, and then 5 years go by. And if you just say, you know what? It's easy. I'm going to read 5 or 10 pages today. You'll read 10 books a year, 15 books a year. And then suddenly the snowball starts compounding positively. So
Yeah.
that's how I think about that.
Cool. 2 key words here, discipline and consistency. If you do it
100%.
consistently, that's where you're going to be successful for sure. I have a lot of you say to me, oh, Dennis, I don't have time. I've got all this on. I go, okay, cool. You're going to be an average to below average kind of a leader. What? Over time, that's what's going to happen for you.
Yeah.
Because if you're not consistent and you're doing those small pieces that are going to count, over time, it's going to compound. It's going to be really massive. And so there's things out there nowadays called executive book summaries. They take the 300 pages and they summarize it into 8 pages and they give you the nuggets. And you can listen to it or you can read it. And it's in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. What do you mean you don't have time? Of course you can.
Yep.
How are you getting to work? Oh, I'm driving for 40 minutes or an hour. Well, what are you doing there? Thinking about life? Well, yeah, maybe. But that's downtime, which I find is dead time. Use it. I think it's very important.
My much to my wife's chagrin, but I pretty much listening to something 20, like I'm like brushing my teeth, listening to something. I'm getting dressed, I'm listening to something. Like I have content piped in almost constantly.
Yep. I do the same. And even if I'm getting ready in the morning and things like that, it's time that I can use. And does it all go in? Well, subconsciously it's going in. Do I always hear it? Maybe not. Sometimes I have to rewind and things like that, but I'm doing it.
I think that's also it's like a false standard, because if you read a book a month later, you're only going to retain probably 10% of it anyway, right? So if you listen to an audiobook and you only retain 10% of it, you're still on par with having sat down and really dedicated your time to reading it too.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Matt, it's been fascinating talking with you today. If our listeners are wanting to get hold of you, where can they go?
Easiest place is just my website, mattbodnar.com. I've got a newsletter there where I talk about doing deals and occasionally dive into some other topics like we've talked about today around psychology and investing and all that kind of stuff too.
Excellent. Well, once again, Matt, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been great talking to you. There you go, listeners. Well, it's about rapport building. It's a foundational thing as leaders we need to do. But if you can build a bridge of trust, that's going to help navigate the journey with your customers, with your teams, and so forth. Collaborative leadership is what Matt talked about, but also start reflecting on yourself. And the fact that is, you can read as much as you like, you can buy as much as you like, but until you apply things, it doesn't even matter. Because the real key here is applying it and putting it into action. Hey, thanks for joining us today. Until next time, bye for now.
Welcome to Leadership is Changing. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change. This is taking your leadership to another level by finding the balance between executive excellence and personal well-being through stories that inspire real change. It's time to adapt in our fast-moving world when leadership is changing with your host, Denis Giannoutsas.